Welcome back. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, here's a big question for you. Was the European Union to blame for last week's devastating global tech outage? Well, that's what Microsoft is claiming at any rate. The company claims a 2009 agreement with the European Commission restricted it from implementing security changes that could have prevented the incident, which led, of course, to widespread disruptions in travel and healthcare around the world. Well, joining me now to discuss this is the privacy and security expert, Jamal Ahmed. Jamal, so Microsoft pointing the finger firmly at Brussels. What's your take?
It's really interesting that Microsoft are blaming EU for this. Essentially, what happened was, many years ago, Microsoft was about to get investigated for anti-competition. And they did a deal with the EU saying that they would allow other developers API access to the kernel level, which means that anyone has the same level of access to Microsoft as Microsoft does itself. And what Microsoft's argument here is because the EU had forced us, or because we agreed with the EU that we would allow other developers to access at the kernel level, we couldn't block this from being rolled out, and that's what has affected those 8.5 million Microsoft computers worldwide. Now, the reason Microsoft are unhappy about this is because when they look at Google and when they look at Apple, they haven't been forced, or they haven't agreed to give such access to anyone else, and so Microsoft are unhappy about that. And they're saying, if we had not had to sign this agreement to give this level of access to people, this would never have been rolled out, and this global outage, the biggest global outage that we've seen in the world's history, would never have taken place.
And Jamal, that begs the question. I mean, it had all the hallmarks of a cyber attack that Vladimir Putin would have been proud of. And isn't the point this? Bureaucrats in Brussels shouldn't be telling expert companies with so much at stake what to do. Apple said no to Brussels. As you said, Google said no to Brussels, and they said no precisely because they claimed, correctly as it looks like, that giving third parties access to that depth, that real nucleus of the code, can cause disasters just like this. That would say to me, QED, Brussels meddling was counterproductive.
There's a couple of ways of looking at this. So number one is it was actually Microsoft that agreed to this to begin with, to stop that. Whereas companies like Apple have said, no, what we're actually going to do is we're going to focus on the security ourselves because we don't want to give anyone else access to this kernel layer. And then on the other hand, you've got Vladimir Putin, who I'm sure is having a right laugh because this is not a cyber attack. In fact, CrowdStrike, the company behind this push and update, are there to help businesses to keep the attackers, the bad guys, Putin, the Russian's army, doing these cyber attacks out. And so they rolled this update out, and it had a flaw in the update. And because of that, all of the screens went blue, which means people couldn't see and people couldn't access anything on those screens. They couldn't access patient records, they couldn't access flight information, and that's why we had such a big outage. Now, it is not really fair to say Brussels is responsible for that. Yes, the agreement has allowed for this to happen, but Microsoft needs to take some responsibility and say, instead of agreeing to that, what could they have done instead? And now that we know this has happened, how do we stop this from happening in future?
Well, maybe we could start, Jamal Ahmed, with stopping bureaucrats poking their noses into areas of expertise where the experts are best serving our interests. Superb. Thank you, Jamal Ahmed. Thank you for joining us on the show.